What if everything you thought you knew about Viking masculinity was wrong? We picture them as brutal warriors, iron-hearted raiders, men of conquest and blood. But buried deep beneath the battlefield myths lies a truth. Historians rarely discuss a secret about love identity and forbidden desire in the Norse world. Did the Vikings accept same-sex relationships? Were there hidden rules or deadly consequences for those who broke tradition? What really happened inside the longhouses far from the eyes of gods and kings? You're about to discover a chapter of Viking history that was almost erased, but not quite. Before we dive in, drop a comment with the time you're watching this morning. Midnight doesn't matter. We see you. And if you love uncovering history's hidden layers, consider subscribing. No pressure. But around here, we tell the stories most channels are afraid to touch. Ready to enter the shadows of Valhalla? Let's begin. You open your eyes in the mist of the ancient north. There's no phone, no ramen noodles. Just the scent of wood smoke, salted meat hanging from rafters, and the clanging rhythm of metal meeting metal in a forge. This is the Viking Age, a world of thick beards, thick fur, and even thicker silence around certain subjects. Glory in battle is everything. But not everything is carved in runestones. Some things lurk in the shadows, spoken only in glances, never in words. You've dropped into a culture where masculinity is practically a religion. A single clean axe throw makes you a local celebrity. But while everyone's raising horns of mead and yelling about conquest somewhere behind the longhouse, eyes linger too long, hands brush on purpose, and shared sleeping furs mean more than just keeping warm. So here's the question. If a Viking man felt something real for another man, something tender, something longing, was he still seen as a warrior? The Vikings didn't have a concept of homosexuality like we do today. No rainbow banners, no boxes to check on a census form. But that doesn't mean same-gender attraction didn't exist. It means it existed without a label, without a name, often without a voice. Like a wolf in the fog, you sense it, but don't dare speak of it too loudly. You take a walk through a coastal village in the 9th century. There's Skjold the shipbuilder, known for crafting long ships that skim the sea like gulls. No one questions why he never marries. They just whisper about his strange closeness with Eirik, the blacksmith, with burn-scarred hands and a crooked grin. The two of them hunt together, eat together, drink together, and always sleep in the same hut. They're just friends, someone says, and then lets the sentence die in the air. This was the Viking way. Carve your war stories into rock, but let your softer truths disappear like breath in winter air. Relationships that didn't fit the warrior mold were quietly sidestepped. No official records, just rumors baked into silence. Oddly enough, at this same point in history, thousands of miles away in Japan, samurai could form intimate bonds with each other without scandal. But here in Scandinavia, land of berserkers, gods, and long winters, the male identity was chained tightly to control aggression and the appearance of dominance. Remind you of anything. Even today, in some places, men are expected to be tough, quiet, emotionless, crying weakness, vulnerability, shameful. And back then, the rules were even more brutal. If a Viking was seen as being lesser in control, in status, or in bed, it could damage his honor permanently. You hear the story of Halldor, son of a local chieftain. He refused to marry 3 women, in fact. People talked. His parents worried. Some said he was different. But no one could question his warrior status. He never lost a wrestling match, and was an expert with the bow. Once villagers whispered he gave a silver ring to his close friend Bjorn during a strange little ceremony by the river. But no one asked questions. And Haldor, like many others, slipped quietly into the forgotten margins of history. You starting to notice the pattern? In Viking culture, closeness between men could exist so long as it didn't announce itself. You could hug. You could sleep side by side. You could even call each other soul bonded in private. Just don't cross the invisible line. And if you do, don't get caught. The irony is, the line wasn't even clear. It wasn't about love. It was about power. If you were the one being dominated socially or sexually, you could be mocked, even outlawed. Not because of who you loved, but because of what role you played. Viking society feared shame far more than sin. Sound familiar? Even today, some people care less about orientation and more about how you present, as if being seen as soft, passive, or emotional is somehow a crime worse than theft. And then there's the unspoken rule. As long as nobody says it out loud, it didn't happen. Denial becomes protection. Silence becomes survival. You crouch beside the fire, thumbing through brittle sagas, those sprawling tales carved from storm and steel, heavy with blood feuds and gods who don't behave. At first glance, they're all battle cries and bone-snapping glory. But if you listen carefully, really listen, you'll begin to notice what isn't said. The silences between the sword fights, the phrases that drift just shy of confession. You start seeing odd turns of phrase. A warrior held more love for his comrade than any wife. Two men who shared one heart, one hearth, one fate. And then silence. No comment, no judgment, just the next voyage or duel. It's as if the scribes left a space where your thoughts are meant to wander. These stories don't speak in declarations. They hint. They murmur. They let you drift near the edge of something tender and then pull away. A man grieves another not as a brother or a fellow fighter, but with a sorrow so intimate it nearly breaks the rhythm of the saga. And then without pause, the tale gallops forward. There's a moment in Njal's saga, a tale more layered than most, where the bond between two men, Njal and Gunnar, stands out. Their affection, their loyalty, the sheer grief when one is gone. It's enough to make you stop and ask, was this just friendship, born of shared bloodshed, or something deeper left unsaid? And the sagas, well, they never confirm, but they certainly don't deny. But then the tone shifts when you reach the insults. Suddenly the language sharpens. The most cutting thing a man could be called wasn't coward or traitor, but something closer to ergi, a word that brims with contempt. To be called arger was to be smeared with the accusation of unmanliness, not for feeling love, but for being the one who was seen to yield. It wasn't about emotion, it was about power. A man accused of losing his masculine dominance, especially in any sexual context, was disgraced in the eyes of others, whether the accusation was true or not. Viking society had an unspoken balance. You could admire another man, even embrace him in battle or grief, but the line was drawn where control seemed to shift. The fear wasn't love. The fear was surrender. Still, you come across tales that refuse to be neatly categorized. There's the quiet story of Thorstein and Grim. Side by side, in war, never seen apart in peace. They built a life that required no wives, no heirs, just each other, and a house at the edge of the woods. The saga says they were well satisfied in one another's company. That's all. No more, no less. And that silence, it echoes louder than any battle horn. You keep reading and find lines of poetry, skaldic verses composed not for war, but for men whose strength was seen in the way they looked at each other. Some poems speak of a warrior's hair, like golden fields, of a voice that stirred something in the chest, not the sword arm. These aren't metaphors of competition, they're songs of longing. Take Egil Skallagrimsson, for instance, famous for splitting skulls as easily as he did stanzas. His verses hold strange flashes of tenderness when he describes fellow men. Not in every line, not always clearly, but enough to raise your eyebrow and make you read it again slower this time. And then there's Armad, a lesser-known skald whose verses didn't make it into grand collections, but survive on a single piece of carved pine found in the wreckage of an old farmstead. He wrote of a man who smelled of ash and pine and stood like a cliff in the wind. His name lost, his story vanished, but his emotion etched deep-weathered but intact. You glance back over the sagas you've read, some filled with fire and vengeance, others quieter, softer. And it's in those quiet ones where you find the most telling absences. No one condemns, no one celebrates, no one names what might have been love. But the feeling lingers like breath and frost. You begin to realize the Viking world didn't erase queerness, it folded it into the folds of its stories, wrapped in wool tucked between lines, hidden but never fully gone. You step into the fog of Viking morality, now a place full of half-spoken truths and tangled threads. There were no books of commandments carved in stone, no single scroll listing what was right or wrong. Instead, there were expectations, things you simply knew not to do, even if no one had said it aloud. And when it came to love, intimacy, or anything that made you look soft in the eyes of other men, silence wasn't just recommended, it was survival. Honor was the currency. Lose it, and you might as well vanish. But how you lost it, that's where things got complicated. A man who cried at a funeral, that could be forgiven. A man who loved another too openly, that could not. You hear again about Ergi, but now it takes a new shape. Not just as insult, but as accusation. If a man was suspected of being Arger, even without proof, he could be denied entry to trade gatherings, barred from settling land, or challenged in court, not because he had harmed anyone, but because he had stepped outside the unwritten circle of masculine control. There's a tale from the inland valleys about two brothers, one strong, and celebrated the other, quiet, more inclined to weaving than war. The village boys mocked the younger one behind his back, called him half-woman, whispered that he sewed more than he spoke. His brother, ashamed, refused to defend him. The younger brother eventually vanished into the forests, never seen again. No crime was recorded, no exile declared, and yet he disappeared. Not by punishment, but by pressure. And here lies the cruel brilliance of Viking moral codes. They didn't always need laws. They had expectation. You didn't have to be outlawed to be erased. You just had to be inconvenient. Even within families, affection was shown carefully. Fathers didn't kiss sons. Brothers didn't say, "I love you." That kind of language belonged to women or to the dead. So if two men found love in each other, how could they possibly name it? They didn't. They showed it in quiet ways, through loyalty, through shared homes, through the decision to never marry and never explain why. Some of those gestures became part of local memory. In one fishing village on the edge of the northern coast, two men named Aki and Thormod were said to have spent 40 winters in the same hut. They raised goats, told stories by candlelight, and died just a month apart. People called them inseparable friends, but someone long after carved a heart between their names on a grave marker deep in the moss. A simple shape barely visible now, No one knows who carved it. No one ever dared remove it. You begin to see how intimacy found ways to exist without names. It slipped through cracks, lingered in gestures, buried itself in domestic routines that looked ordinary but weren't. Like two warriors sharing one bowl. Like one man sewing the other's cloak by firelight. The things no saga would waste ink on, but which carried entire lifetimes of meaning. Even religion didn't offer clarity. The Norse gods were complicated. They changed shape, changed gender, deceived, and seduced. There was no clear moral hierarchy in their myths. But in real life, people were expected to play their part, to perform their gender, their role, their place. To step out of that role, even in joy or love, was to invite doubt. And in small communities, doubt was enough to destroy. You start to feel the weight of it, how exhausting it must have been to live within so many invisible fences. To know that a misstep wouldn't lead to a whip or a judge, but to the slow turning away of neighbors. The empty seat at the feast. The silence at the hearth. It wasn't law that cut deepest. It was isolation. And yet for some, that risk was worth it. Because sometimes story is all you have. And in Viking mythology, story is where the boundaries blur the most, especially when the gods themselves refuse to follow the rules mortals die trying to uphold. You walk deeper into the mist of legend now, where thunder cracks like judgment and trickery is considered divine. Here stands Loki, the shape changer, the sly one, a god who does not ask permission to cross lines. He leaps over them grinning. In a world where human men are bound by reputation and fear of shame, Loki moves freely, shedding skin, swapping roles, slipping between male and female, as if the difference were as thin as smoke. You hear the tale again. Loki, in the form of a mare, seduces a powerful stallion to prevent a giant from finishing his work. It's a joke, almost a bit of clever mischief. But then he conceives, carries the foal, and gives birth to Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse destined to carry Odin himself. No punishment, no shame, just a story retold with a laugh, as though a male god becoming a mother were a footnote, not a scandal. And you begin to understand the gods weren't bound by the same codes as men. For mortals stepping out of your assigned role invited insult, exile, or death. But for gods, crossing those same boundaries brought fame, even reverence. Loki breaks rules because he can. Because in myth, disruption is necessary. Still, he is not without consequence. Loki is beloved and hated, needed and mistrusted. He makes the gods laugh, then makes them nervous. His gender bending and chaos weaving don't always feel rebellious. Sometimes they feel honest, as if Loki is showing the world what it fears in itself. Then there's Odin, the All-Father. A warrior, a king, a seeker of knowledge who, unlike any other male deity, openly practices Scyther, the mysterious Norse magic associated with women. It's not soft magic. It's powerful, terrifying, able to alter fate. And yet for mortal men learning, it was considered shameful. Only Odin could do it without ridicule, because only Odin stood so far above reproach that no one dared question his authority. So here you have it, two of the most powerful gods in the Norse pantheon, actively crossing gender expectations. Odin through magic, Loki through transformation. Both operating outside the boundaries that human men were expected to guard with blood. You remember a fireside story about Adis, a vulva, a seeress, who once lived on the coast. She trained with a man named Svanr, they say. No one ever saw Svanr wear men's clothes, and his voice was said to be gentler than the sea in spring. He would chant long into the night, foretelling storms and births alike. Some called him cursed. Adis called him teacher. After one winter he vanished. No body, no goodbye. Only a strand of beads left on her staff, and a carved rune near the shoreline, a spiral within a spiral. Was Svanr real? No saga records him, but people remembered. And that's how the myths lived, braided into daily life, sometimes whispered as truth, sometimes used to explain what polite conversation avoided. If the gods could be fluid, could shift and change and love in strange shapes, perhaps there was room for humans to feel these things too, even if they couldn't say them. You wonder how many quiet boys listened to tales of Loki and felt a strange comfort, not from his mischief, but from his motion, his refusal to be one thing, his ability to be both, to create life and chaos in the same breath, to exist where rules are soft and nothing is fixed. That's the power of story. It holds what society can't. And for some, it was the only place they were ever allowed to exist at all. But on the edges of battlefields, under tents, thick with sweat and smoke, something else was growing, something not told in sagas or carved into stone. Bonds between men that weren't made of blood or oath, but of something quieter, something stronger. You step into the circle of warriors, men cloaked in iron and silence. They drink together, fight together, sleep side by side on cold ground, with only their breath and blades for warmth. These are not soft men. They're hardened, scarred, deadly. But among them, in the moments between violence, tenderness can bloom like moss in stone cracks, unnoticed by most, but rooted deep. There was a kind of love here that dared not name itself. The kind built over seasons of surviving beside one another, of tending wounds and sharing stolen bread. A love that grew not in stolen glances, but in the quiet fact of choosing to live another day, if only to see one face again. You hear stories passed down in the corners of longhouses, like the tale of Brander and Holly, two warriors who never married, never parted, and were always chosen together for raids. No one asked why. No one needed to. They fought as one body, their timing so perfect it became legend. Some said their swords never clashed unless in practice with each other. When Holly fell in battle, Brander refused to flee. He held the dying man in his arms and sang not a war song, but a lullaby his mother once sang to him beneath northern stars. Their chieftain, who had known them since youth, buried them side by side in a single grave. The stones around their mound bore no runes, but someone no one knows, who later carved a ring between their names. No one ever removed it. These weren't isolated cases. There are more whispers if you know where to listen. Bonds that stretch past strategy and into something else entirely. But the line between friendship and something more was always hidden in fog. Perhaps by design, perhaps for protection. It wasn't unusual for Viking warriors to share sleeping space, to travel in pairs, to spend years of their lives tied to the same man more closely than to their families. But if that bond crossed into something deeper, into love, longing, even physical closeness, it had to remain unspoken, wrapped tightly in layers of duty loyalty, or the ever-convenient label of brotherhood. It reminds you of how the world often tolerates what it refuses to see. If something is invisible, it doesn't challenge the order of things. If two men live together for decades but never say why, well then no rules are broken, even though everyone knows, and always did. But for those living it, there must have been moments. A lingering look after battle, a hand gripping a wrist too tightly too long, the ache when the other was gone. These things live in the spaces between stories because they were too risky to say aloud. You think of an imaginary man, though you're certain someone like him must have lived Hror, a berserker who wore the skins of bears and feared nothing, except losing Leif, his shield brother. They met in their 12th year, survived 4 winters of brutal campaigns, and once held off a dozen men by guarding each other's backs. No one dared mock them, not because people didn't wonder, but because no one wanted to face the rage of Hror if they did. People didn't need confirmation. They needed myths to stay intact. And so long as the love stayed behind closed tent flaps, it could be ignored. But what is brotherhood truly, if not a space where vulnerability is allowed to breathe? Viking society praised loyalty and honor among men, yet feared what might happen if that loyalty became too tender, too visible. So these bonds stronger than iron were folded into the culture's blind spot. They were tolerated until they weren't, accepted until someone asked the wrong question, and then the silence would fall again. Especially when the world of men began to blur with the world of magic, where boundaries softened and even more, rules dissolved into mist. You step into the dim, smoky tent of a Sather worker, a practitioner of Norse sorcery. The air is thick with the scent of burning herbs, and strange symbols hang from the rafters. This is not a warrior's world. This is a place of visions of chance that call winds of knowledge that unsettles the proud. And here it's no longer just about power through strength, it's about power through the unseen. Sather was magic of the deep kind, the kind that touched fate, unraveled secrets, and foretold doom. And it was feared, not just because of what it could do, but because of who often wielded it. Women mostly, but sometimes men. And when they did, society grew uneasy. To practice Sather as a man was to walk a narrow ridge between reverence and ridicule. It required robes, rituals, and the adoption of traits that Viking society labeled as feminine. The practitioner might wear flowing garments, speak in altered tones, or step away from the behaviors expected of a warrior. And for many, that was enough to invite suspicion. Or worse. You hear of men who risked everything to study it. Like Steiger, a man from the northern forests remembered only in the stories of a coastal village. He was called half-man by some, and stormcaller by others. His rituals brought safety to ships and healed sick children, yet he was never allowed to sit at the high table. He walked the village, edge-eyes downcast, always watched, never welcomed. But people still came to him. At night, in secret. You sense it clearly now. Queerness and magic in Viking society were often treated the same way. Feared, needed, hidden. Not because either was evil, but because both slipped beyond control. And that frightened those who wanted everything neat and named. The word Seidmadur man, who practices Sather, carried layers of tension. On one hand, it marked a man as someone with knowledge of the divine. On the other, it made him suspect. To step into this role was to risk being labeled Arger. That same accusation we've heard before, tied not just to passivity, but to stepping outside masculine decorum. So a man could heal a dying child and still be mocked because he wore a blue robe while doing it. And yet, for some that calling was stronger than fear. There's an old tale passed down among farmers about Arni, a ciderman, who lived alone at the edge of the wetlands. He was known to wear silver rings and speak to ravens. Most villagers avoided him in daylight. But they tell a quieter part of the story too, of his deep affection for a fisherman named Vaughn. The two were often seen exchanging fish for herbs, standing too close, speaking too softly. One winter, Vang drowned, and though no ritual was asked for, Arnie stood waist deep in the frozen fjord at dawn, chanting until his voice broke. That year, the herring returned in record numbers. They say no one ever called him Arger again. You realize something vital here, those who walk the line between gender, between power and tenderness, between love and magic, weren't erased completely. They were remembered. Not always kindly, but never forgotten. Because in some small way, people feared what they might lose if they disappeared. Cider made space for those who didn't fit. Not just men who loved differently, but anyone who stepped outside the hard-edged codes of Viking behavior. It offered a path not safe, but possible. Still, it's hard to ignore the price. Isolation, mockery, the constant need to justify one's place, and the knowledge that even your usefulness didn't guarantee acceptance. So those who practiced Seidr, those who lived on love whispered, rather than shouted, learned to survive by becoming myth themselves. Because if you became too strange to judge, you might become too sacred to touch. And nowhere was that truer than among the women who chose to live outside the lines entirely. Women who fought, who hunted, who wore armor as easily as silence. Shield maidens, they were called. But there's more to them than the stories allow. You walk with them now, through wind-swept hills and training fields, marked not by plows, but by axes. They are not common. Not every village welcomed them. Not every saga recorded their names. But they appear again and again, like flares in the dark, women who refused to marry, refused to serve ale, and instead rode into battle with the fury of a winter storm. The most famous is Lagertha, her name echoing from the Gesta Danorum, where she slays men and leads armies with a calm more terrifying than rage. She was said to have been once married to Ragnar Lodbrok, but not before she had proven herself more than his equal in war. And even then she left him, returned to rule on her own. That part conveniently gets glossed over in later tellings. You start to notice a pattern shield maidens are often remembered, but rarely explained. Why did they choose this path? Why didn't they marry? Why were they always so alone? Perhaps not so alone. There's a mention in one Icelandic folk tale of two women, Hervor and Astrid, who trained together from childhood, shared one sword between them, and were buried in the same mound with only one name etched into the stone valiant, nothing more. Their story isn't found in royal chronicles. It was passed on by shepherds and weavers as if to say, we remember, even if the scribes won't. Shield maidens lived in the same strange space as Seidr men, tolerated if useful, respected if victorious, but never quite allowed to be ordinary. And when women formed close bonds with other women, it was dismissed as sisterhood, as training companionship, because what else could it be? But you know the difference. A shared cloak in winter. A glance held too long when spears clashed in practice. An oath made not to a god, but to each other, sealed in blood beneath the birches. There's no law against it, no rune that bans it. But that doesn't mean it was safe. You meet another name in passing, Freydis Eric's daughter, half hero, half controversy daughter of Eric the Red. In one tale, she's a fierce fighter defending a settlement from native attacks in Vinland by grabbing a sword while pregnant and chasing off enemies by sheer force of will. In another, she's accused of betrayal and murder. The contrast tells you more about her time than about her deeds. A woman who didn't conform had to be either a legend or a villain, never simply human. You think of an unnamed shield maiden whose existence was only discovered because of her grave. found in Birka, Sweden, laid to rest with a full warrior's set swords armor horses. At first, archaeologists assumed the body was male. When testing revealed it was female, the debate exploded. Surely she must have been ceremonial. Surely a mistake. But the grave said otherwise. She was buried not as a wife, not as a mother, as a commander. And still some historians hesitated to call her what she was. This tells you something deeply familiar, that even centuries later, we still struggle to believe that those who defy gender roles can lead, can love, can exist without explanation. Shield maidens weren't just warriors. They were a rupture in the fabric of what Viking womanhood was supposed to be. And those who shared their lives, their tents, and maybe more, they too were erased under the guise of discipline and martial respect. But if you listen between the clang of sword and shield, you'll hear it. Laughter that lingers too long after nightfall. A lullaby not meant for children. A name spoken like a prayer just before battle. And though their stories were rarely written, their footsteps still press into the earth quiet but unshakable. Until the law stepped in, not with clarity, but with its own brand of silence. You sift now through the brittle pages of Viking legal codes, the grim heart of Norse justice. And what you find is strangely uneven. You expect to see thunderbolts, harsh decrees, maybe even dramatic punishments scrawled beside accusations of same-gender love. But instead, you find hesitation, vague words, missing lines, a quiet where a verdict should be. Unlike later Christian laws, Viking-era codes don't outright ban homosexuality. There is no sweeping condemnation carved into birch bark or etched in stone. Instead, what you find is a fixation on shame, on reputation, on whether someone has been dishonored, not whether they have loved. Take the Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code. It does mention male-male sex, but only through the lens of insult of dominance of accusing a man of being arger without cause. What's punishable isn't the act itself, but the insult implying it. The legal concern is the shattering of status, not the emotion, not the intimacy. You start to see the shape of something strange, a world that feared reputation more than love. Still, there were consequences. You couldn't marry someone of the same sex. Marriage was tied to inheritance land and family alliances. And women, especially if they chose to live outside the expected roles, could find themselves cut off, disinherited, quietly exiled from their clan. But again, it was rarely about the act. It was about the disruption, the break in lineage, the way your existence challenged the structure. You remember a story passed down in whispers from a coastal farmstead of two women, Yrsa and Dagny, who ran off together to live in the high valleys. They took sheep tools and the family's best spinning wheel. When Dagny's father found their hut a year later, he didn't drag them home. He took the wheel and left. That was his statement, not violence, but disownment. The kind of punishment that leaves no scars on the skin, but plenty on the soul. For men, consequences often came in layers. If a man of low status was accused of same-gender intimacy and lacked allies, he might find himself refused trade, blocked from feasts, or worst of all, laughed at, not jailed, just dismissed. And in a society built on communal strength, laughter could be lethal. There's a case recorded in fragments about a man named Snorri, once a skilled rune carver. He was accused of behaving like a woman after a bitter rival spread stories about his closeness with a foreign guest. No duel was fought. No court was held. But Snorri's commissions dried up. The local jarl never called for him again. Within 2 winters, He was gone, his workshop taken over by a younger man who carved with less grace but made no enemies. And yet there were moments when love endured. You come across a note, just a side mention, in an inheritance dispute. Two men, Skeggi and Jorund, had lived together for over 20 years. One died. The other claimed their shared land. The family protested, but the court ruled in Jorund's favor. Not because they were lovers, no one said that, but because the village recognized their bond as valid, as real, even without a name for it. And maybe that's the strangest part. The law didn't know how to name what it couldn't control, so it danced around it, punished it sideways, acknowledged it only when it had to. You can feel the tension crackling beneath the surface. This wasn't a culture of openness, but it wasn't one of total denial either. Viking law didn't hunt down queerness the way later religious courts would. It tolerated, it avoided, it sidestepped, and when necessary, it pretended not to see. But people lived in that gap. They built lives there on shaky legal ground and strong private bonds, and sometimes that was just enough. But when words failed and law looked away, the truth still surfaced in the dirt, the stones, the graves left behind. Because the dead can't lie, and their burial choices sometimes whisper what the living dared not say aloud. This is what burial tells us, what mattered most at the end: who you were, what you wanted to take with you, and sometimes who you loved. There are graves across the Norse world that challenge the neat categories of masculine and feminine. A body buried in what appears to be women's clothing, but with male anatomy. A man laid to rest with glass beads and a brooch in the traditional female style. The positions of the grave goods, the orientation of the body, the items they chose to carry into the next world, they all speak louder than the laws ever did. You come across a burial in Gotland. A person dressed in robes, surrounded by weaving tools and a few runic charms, laid next to another of the same sex. The records call it unusual, but that's only because the categories didn't stretch far enough to hold them. And then there are the graves that hold two. Paired burials, rare but real. Two men side by side with no record of blood relation, no mention of combat, just together. Often one slightly turned toward the other. It's not proof, but it's presence. And presence matters. You think of a tale from the far north of Ketil and Arvid, two men who lived in a fishing hut for 30 years long after anyone else on that coastline stayed. When they died in the same storm, the village buried them together under a stone with no carvings. Years later, someone returned and etched one word home. Burial practices often reflected how someone lived or how their community chose to remember them, which means even in death there were choices. Were you buried with a sword or a spindle? A drinking horn or a comb? Your father's axe or your lover's necklace? In a grave found near Hedeby, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton buried with both a sword on one side, a set of fine textile tools on the other. Male anatomy, a body that seemed to walk both paths. Maybe they were a warrior, maybe a weaver, or maybe both, maybe neither. We don't know the names. We don't know the stories. But the graves are real, and they don't lie. What they do, though, is resist. They resist the tidy labels historians try to stamp onto them. They resist the idea that gender love and purpose can be divided neatly. They speak in contradiction in blended roles, in silence that holds shape. You realize now where the sagas dodged the graves testified, where the laws avoided the dead revealed. These quiet earthen testaments stand against the noise of judgment. They remind us that Vikings were not monoliths of masculinity, not statues of strength. They were people, complicated, contradictory, layered, and in the soil beneath your feet, some of them are still speaking. And if you're quiet enough, they're not hard to hear, though you may have to listen through layers of translation judgment and smoke from another kind of fire. Because once the Vikings stopped speaking for themselves, others rushed in to speak for them. You turn now to the parchment-stained voices of Christian chroniclers, the monks, the missionaries, the distant observers cloaked not in furs, but in cassocks. They came with crosses, yes, but also with ink. And they rewrote the sagas, not with axes or runes, but with tidy Latin sentences and the moral certainty of men who had never once sailed a longship. They did not understand the intimacy of shared cloaks or the softness between warriors. They didn't see Seder as sacred or silence as survival. What they saw, they misnamed, and what they feared, they condemned. Take Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote of the Norse with the polished sneer of a man both fascinated and appalled. He preserved stories of strong women like Lagertha, but coded them in disbelief as though a woman holding a sword was a strange mistake of nature. When same-gender closeness crept into the narrative, he either ignored it or reshaped it into something grotesque. Viking affection became vice. Tenderness between men became mockery, or worse, evidence of corruption. And so slowly, the image of the Viking shifted. No longer a complicated human capable of contradictions. Now, a brute, a savage, a beast tamed only by the light of Christ. You can feel it in the language. Words like sodomy and unnatural appear like smudges over older, subtler truths. The old gods become demons. The old ways become perversions. What was once myth memory or love becomes something to be burned. But the monks didn't erase everything. In their horror, they left fingerprints, accusations that reveal more than they intended. When a Christian writer warns that Norsemen share beds too easily or mourn each other too deeply, he's not just preaching. He's reporting, accidentally preserving what he hoped would disappear. You imagine one of them, let's call him Brother Anselm, crouched over a desk in a stone monastery, ink-stained fingers trembling as he records a tale told to him by a Norse convert. The tale is simple: two men bonded not by blood, but by choice, living together in the mountains, growing old beside one another. Anselm frowns. He doesn't understand. He writes it down anyway, but adds a warning. Such customs lead men into darkness. He seals it with a cross, and in doing so, he preserves it. This is how queerness survived, not through approval, but through obsession. Not because the monks accepted it, but because they couldn't stop circling it. They couldn't understand why some men didn't marry, why some women refused husbands, why grief could burn so hot between people who weren't kin. So they recorded it with suspicion and gave us, centuries later, faint echoes of what they wished would fade. But suspicion leaves a trail, and sometimes a trail is all you need. So you keep following it, past the pulpits and the polished Latin, into the wild, wind-beaten edges of the Viking world, where love didn't always need permission to exist. You sail now, not across oceans of war, but across trade routes, merchant alleys, and the soft murmur of markets that stretch from the icy north to the golden sands of distant cities. Because the Vikings were not just raiders, they were traders, explorers, diplomats when it suited them. And with every voyage, they didn't just bring home spices, glassware, and silver. They brought back stories, customs, sometimes even lovers from far beyond their fjords. You find yourself walking through Hedeby one of the largest trading towns of the Norse world. It hums with many tongues: Arabic Greek, Slavic Old Norse. There are silks here, peacocks, coins from Baghdad. The smell of foreign incense curls through the streets like a secret. In this place, the lines between cultures blur, and so do the rules. Here, a Norseman named Svein might share a stall with a merchant from the Abbasid Caliphate. They speak in gestures at first, then broken trade words. They smile. They meet again. Soon they drink together at dusk. Soon after that, perhaps they share more than wine. Is it love companionship? A transaction you'll never know. But it happens. It had to. Because this is what people do when borders shrink and curiosity outpaces fear. One Arabic traveler, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, wrote extensively about the Norse he encountered along the Volga. He marveled at their customs, some crude, some fascinating. While his descriptions were sometimes dismissive, they also hinted at a kind of openness that disturbed him. He noted their bathing habits, their ritual cleanliness, their comfort with nudity. He noticed, too, how they touched one another. Not always violently. Not always with the reserve expected in his world. That tension, the one between what was happening and what could be written, is everywhere in these travel accounts. The writers often condemned, but they couldn't look away. And their discomfort leaves you clues. Imagine a man like Eric, a Norse trader, who spends half the year sailing and the other half in the bustling city of Constantinople, where Vikings served as Varangian guards. He learns the local customs, learns the language, shares a home with another guard named Demetrios. They spar together, feast together, sleep in a narrow stone room with a single hearth. They call each other brother, but that word stretches beyond blood. No one questions it because no one wants to break the quiet balance of what's mutually convenient and privately understood. That was the rule of the road. Don't name it, don't challenge it, just let it be. In far-off eastern cities among domes and minarets, Viking men saw a different model of masculinity, one not always defined by loud violence, but by poetry, wisdom, even softness. And some brought those impressions home, maybe not in stories told at the feast hall, but in how they carried themselves, in how they remembered a voice, a touch. Some even converted to Islam, not because they were conquered, but because they were moved. They built homes abroad, married foreign partners, lived in translation for the rest of their days. And in doing so, they stepped further from the hard lines of northern tradition and closer to something freer, if more uncertain. You can feel it in the artifacts. A comb with Arabic script, a necklace with a foreign charm, a small glass bottle of oil found in a Norse grave far from any desert. Trade wasn't just commerce, it was intimacy, cultural, emotional, physical. And so you realize queerness in the Viking world didn't always grow in defiance. Sometimes it traveled, smuggled in between bolts of silk and sacks of saffron, hidden in laughter between two men who didn't share a language but shared something else, something older, something universal. And when they parted, because most did, the memory stayed. Because longing like trade leaves marks. And now you follow that longing not on ships or trade routes this time, but into the woods, the rivers, the remote fjords, where no laws reached and no one watched. Because even in a society thick with expectations, silence could still carve space for freedom. You step into the twilight of a Norse forest clearing. The trees groan in the wind like old gods muttering. The land is vast quiet and blessedly wild. This is where those who didn't quite fit often ended up not exiled, but self-removed. Herbalists, spirit workers, warriors who'd seen too much, and sometimes lovers who could never be lovers in the open. There were names for these places: hidden farms, secluded cabins, remote fishing villages, places where everyone knew but no one asked. Places where two women might live together as widows or spinsters when neither had ever been married. Where two men might build a boat together and never once speak of why neither took a wife. Because when the world is harsh, what matters most is that someone shares your fire. There are sagas quietly whispered of shield maidens who would not marry, of men who wandered into the forest and came back changed clothed differently, speaking in riddles, but wiser. There's one story of a woman named Hervor, who dressed as a man and fought with sword and flame, refusing all roles handed to her. She reclaimed her father's enchanted blade from his ghost. Her tale is one of power, but also of slipping through gender's grip like mist through fingers. These tales were not always condemned. Some were admired, even feared, because in the Viking mind, to live on your own terms, especially in defiance of what was expected, meant you had strength, maybe even magic. And this is where queerness often hid in plain sight, behind the veil of the mysterious, the odd, the sacred. The concept of ergi might have been used to insult, but in these woods, no one spoke that word. There was no need. What you were didn't matter as much as whether you could hunt, build, heal, protect, or simply stay kind. Consider the archaeological find near Birka, a grave once thought to belong to a high-status male warrior, until closer study revealed the buried person may have been biologically female. Some scholars pushed back. It was too confusing, they argued, but the bones didn't lie. Nor did the weapons, the position of power, the clear military honor in that grave. Perhaps the person was a woman who lived as a man. Or perhaps they were something else entirely. Something we don't have modern words for, but the Vikings made room for them in death. That's the clue. These woods remember all of them. The ones who broke rules not out of rebellion, but because their hearts asked them to. The quiet husbands who left their villages together and never returned. The sisters of spirit who gathered herbs and stories under the same roof until the end of their days. They may not be named in poems, but they are buried beneath stones you can still visit if you know where to walk and when to listen. So much of queer Viking history is whispered, not erased, but disguised, not lost, but translated into metaphors, into the soft space between words. Because sometimes survival meant silence, sometimes freedom meant solitude, but always it meant someone remembered, and tonight, that someone is you. And as you stand there in the quiet of those woods, where truth was worn like a second skin, hidden but never forgotten, you begin to understand something deeper. Queerness wasn't just tucked into the shadows. It also danced in the fires, echoed in the laughter, and whispered in the prayers of those who called the far north home. There's an old story still told in parts of northern Iceland, though most forget its meaning. It speaks of a reclusive weaver named Eirik, who spun thread so fine it shimmered like moonlight on snow. Eirik never spoke of his past, nor did anyone press him. But the local children adored him, especially for the riddles he wove into his cloth. One winter, when a merchant tried to marry off his daughter for land, she fled straight to Eirik's cottage. He took her in, taught her to weave her own story, and in spring she left dressed not in bridal white, but in dyed wool, the color of stormy seas. When asked, she said, "He taught me to live untied." Whether Eric loved men or simply refused to play a man's role, no one knew. Or needed to. He belonged to a quiet brotherhood of those who bent the loom of life in their own way. There were many such weavers of fate. In Norse mythology, the very act of spinning thread and shaping destiny was a sacred task, one often linked to the feminine, but not exclusively. The Norns, those mysterious beings who controlled the threads of all lives, defied gender in many tellings. Some scholars suggest that spiritual figures who dressed or behaved outside expected norms may have been seen as closer to divine forces, neither fully man nor woman, but a bridge between. In this light, queerness wasn't always an aberration. Sometimes it was a blessing, a gift, a reason to listen more closely. That might explain why some Viking-era sorcerers, particularly male ones known as Sademen, were both feared and revered. Practicing cider as a man carried social risk, since it involved stepping into a realm considered feminine. Yet some did it anyway. Were they shamed? Sometimes. Were they ignored? Never. Because their knowledge worked. Crops grew. Illnesses faded. Storms passed. And behind every insult lay a trembling respect. It makes you wonder how many truths lived double lives. How many names like the flickering runes carved into bone told more than one story depending on how you held them to the light. The Norse didn't have our vocabulary. They didn't talk about non-binary or fluid identities with modern terms. But they lived alongside people who simply were. Who shaped their place in the world not by proclamation, but by presence, by skill, by staying. And though many were buried quietly, their legacies did not stay dead. When archaeologists uncover graves where a male skeleton rests with brooches traditionally worn by women, or where warrior tools rest beside textile instruments, the modern mind fumbles. But perhaps the Vikings didn't. Perhaps they understood something we've only just begun to remember, that the soul's truth can't be contained in a single name, a single box, a single role. They honored the whole, even if they didn't always explain it. And so, as you leave the clearing, the wind lifts your cloak like a benediction. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cries. And you know queerness didn't just survive the Viking age. It carved itself into the story. It built homes in the silence. It whispered and was heard. You keep walking further, now past mossy stones and buried roots, until the trees seem to hush the world around you. In this deep quiet, the past feels near again. And so does something else, the persistent question that always lingers at the edge of history. What happened next? Because the saga of queerness in Viking lands didn't end with a soft footfall in snow. It clashed with fire and sword. It collided with the arrival of something vast, something that would change the very sky under which these stories were told Christianity. At first, it came slowly. Missionaries arriving with words instead of axes offering eternity in exchange for transformation. Some communities resisted. Others blended old rites with the new. But over time, as the cross replaced the hammer, a shift took hold. Identities once held in complexity were now marked in sin. You can imagine how it began. A bishop frowning at the Sademen, calling their practice unmanly. A monk rewriting a tale, turning a once sacred ritual into a scandal. A king seeking unity through conformity, stamping out the odd, the untamed, the in-between. And still, queer people endured, even when the law turned against them. Records from medieval Iceland tell us that by the 13th century, male-male intimacy was punishable by death burning or beheading. These laws didn't appear in a vacuum. They mirrored growing church influence across Europe, where sodomy became a word so broad it swallowed up truth and left only fear. But behind every law was a face, a name, a heartbeat. One such name was Jan Ronvaldsson, a man executed in 1625 in Iceland during one of the country's few witch trials. Though remembered as a sorcerer, some oral traditions whisper that he lived apart, dressed strangely, kept company most often with men. The truth is tangled, but one detail remains. He was accused not just of magic, but of disturbing the order, of being different. Then there's the 14th century account from Norway about a woman who lived as a man and worked as a shipbuilder who even married another woman. When discovered, she was brought before the court. But the verdict, not a simple punishment. The court wrestled with the matter for days. Because how do you judge what doesn't fit your mold but clearly exists? And still queer people persisted. Some disguised, some fled, some survived by silence, others by song. In the Pharaoh's folk tales speak of shapeshifters, creatures neither man nor beast, neither one thing nor another. Were these metaphors for those who lived outside gender? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were reminders that not everything strange was cursed, that some things strange were sacred. The church tried to erase, to cleanse, to rewrite. But even it could not fully unweave the threads that had been spun for centuries. Queer identities became quieter, yes, but not invisible, not lost. In household sagas, a bachelor uncle might appear always present, never married oddly close with a traveling merchant. In the graveyards, a warrior's stone might bear no wife's name, but another man's. In lullabies, a line or two would change slightly, carrying double meaning for those who knew how to listen. And the knowing never died. Even today, Iceland stands as one of the most progressive nations on Earth when it comes to LGBTQ+ rights. But that's not an accident of modernity. It's the persistence of memory. The result of centuries where queer people refused to vanish, refused to be erased. It's why the modern queer Icelandic poet Sean often says that he writes as if weaving the future from the forgotten ends of old yarn. So here at the edge of this forest of time, you understand something else. The legacy of queerness in Viking history isn't just survival. It's testimony to the human spirit, to those who refused to be told who they could be, and to those still writing sagas with their own lives in the same fierce wind. The stories whispered through ancient runes and buried beneath layers of frost point to one truth. Viking society was far more complex than legend lets on. Hidden within sagas and bones are echoes of queer lives of love, ritual shame, and resilience. Whether in the sorcerer's trance, the warrior's silent companionship, or the figure who defied gender to live authentically, the presence of queerness is undeniable. Or is it now we turn to you? Do you believe homosexuality truly existed in Viking times? Or are we weaving modern ideas into old myths? Could the truth be both stranger and richer than we imagine? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's open a conversation that history once tried to silence. Because the past doesn't belong to just one voice. It belongs to all who dare to ask, what have we forgotten and why? You wake up to cold. Not the soft kind that makes you want to nestle deeper into blankets, but the kind that bites. The kind that stiffens your joints before your feet even touch the packed earth floor. There are no windows to open, only thin gaps in the wooden walls that let in slivers of light and gusts of icy wind. The hearth in the middle of the room has long since gone out. Its ashes lie cold and gray, and no one stirs to revive it yet. You slept fully clothed because that's what everyone does. Wool tunic, rough linen underneath, and perhaps a bit of fur if you're lucky. Even so, you feel the chill claw at your bones. This is a Viking age longhouse shared by your entire family, perhaps a dozen people, maybe more. There's a little privacy. Everyone breathes the same air, shares the same bed space, hears every cough, every grunt, every whispered word. You can hear livestock nearby too. Some of them sleep inside, penned off in a corner, their body heat a welcome contribution. The smell, however, is less welcome, a constant mix of dung sweat and old smoke. You can't escape it. It's soaked into the wood, the bedding your hair. There's no time to be idle. Your day begins when the light begins, and your stomach will earn its keep only through labor. Breakfast is barley porridge, thin, bland, but warm. If there's goat's milk or dried berries mixed in, it's a good morning. If not, it's just enough to dull the edge of hunger. Utensils are few. You eat with a wooden spoon or your fingers. The bowl is passed between you and your siblings. No one waits for seconds. Outside, the sky is a low gray sheet. Your breath fogs instantly. The ground is frozen stiff. You head out, not for leisure, but because your father has assigned you to help mend the fence. It's falling apart again. The livestock, goats, sheep, maybe a pig or two, must be kept secure, lest the family suffer through spring with even less to trade or eat. You use tools that are basic but effective, an iron axe with a hand-forged head and thick wooden stakes you haul yourself. There's no store to buy nails. You lash the pieces together with twisted rope made from animal sinew and patience. Your hands are quickly numb. Your legs ache from squatting and hauling, and the cold finds every gap in your clothing. But no one complains. Complaining isn't a concept here, it's just life. Everyone works. Even the smallest children carry firewood or collect eggs from the coop. There is no such thing as children's chores. There is only survival. Occasionally you hear the low hum of someone singing your older sister, perhaps chanting as she grinds grain inside on a stone quern. It's rhythmic and slow, the sound of time passing in a world that has no clocks. The idea of boredom doesn't really exist here. There's always something to be done: spinning wool, fixing the roof, salting fish, checking traps. Rest is rare and sacred, but never lazy. As midday approaches, you're given a lump of bread, dense, slightly sour, with bits of coarse grain still in it. It's hearty, if not exactly tasty. There might be some dried fish or fermented cabbage if it's a day of plenty, but often it's just the bread and some water or mead watered down. You drink from a shared wooden cup, wiped only casually before the next person takes it. By now, the sky has changed again. It's threatening snow, and you still have to help with the firewood, splitting logs with a dull axe and stacking them to keep them dry. The fire must never go out at night, especially not in the depths of winter. It's the heart of the home, the one constant source of light, warmth, and protection from the long frozen dark. You take your turns stoking it, feeding it with precious kindling, always careful not to waste a single spark. As evening falls, the longhouse dims to orange firelight and deep shadows. Dinner is little different from breakfast, more porridge maybe, with dried onions or herbs. Conversation is brief and practical. Stories are sometimes told by the eldest, a tale of Thor, or a saga half remembered, passed down through mouths rather than books. You listen in silence, wrapped in an itchy blanket of woven wool, scratching at a flea bite. And then it's sleep again. Not in a bed. There are no real beds, just straw mats laid close together, sometimes sharing furs with another sibling. The fire crackles low, barely enough to beat back the cold. Your body aches, but not from a workout, from labor, from the repetition of necessary things. The Viking Age doesn't grant you much ease. It's relentless in its demands. And this was just your morning and evening. Nothing extraordinary happened. No raids, no feasts, no battles, just survival. And even that for many was more than they could manage. You're a few centuries forward now, and you smell it before you see it. The thick, oily smoke of sizzling fat coils in the air, clinging to your clothes, your hair, your very breath. You're in a medieval town square, maybe in the shadow of a cathedral, still under construction, or wedged between crooked timber-framed shops. The streets are packed with people. Mud and filth coat the ground churned by wooden cartwheels and leather boots. But your eyes are fixed on the row of street vendors, more accurately, rickety carts and benches, each one promising something hot, cheap, and maybe even edible. You don't have many coins, but hunger doesn't wait. There are no restaurants, no dining rooms. For working folk, the midday meal often comes from one of these stalls, where the cook and the food are equally questionable. Yet in a world without refrigeration, without clean water, and with kitchens full of open fires and smoke, the street is often no more dangerous than your own hearth. The choice is fried dough, perhaps small lumps of wheat, paste flattened and tossed onto a greased iron plate over flame. It's served with a smear of garlic paste or coarse salt, or maybe a meat pie if you dare. It smells incredible, and the crust is golden brown from the lard it's been baked in. But what's inside? That's the question you don't ask too loudly. Could be pork. Could be offal. Could be whatever they had left over from the butcher's scraps. Meat was expensive, so pies were the perfect disguise, spicy enough to mask any rot greasy enough to fill your stomach. You chew with one eye on the vendor and one on your surroundings. Food theft is common, and not just from pickpockets. Street dogs, stray cats, and even starving children will snatch food from your hand if you let them. And no one will help you. Everyone's hungry. A few stalls down, you see a huge iron pot bubbling with something thick and beige. Pottage, a staple for centuries. It's an eternal stew, oats or barley, boiled with cabbage, maybe beans, or leeks, whatever's in season. If you're lucky, there might be a bit of fish or bone in it today. If not, the vendor might have added breadcrumbs, crushed acorns, or old cheese rinds to stretch it. You hand over a coin for a ladleful and receive a hunk of stale bread to go with it. You eat standing, leaning against a wall, ignoring the flies. Most of the vendors are unlicensed. Health inspections don't exist. If someone gets sick, well, that's between them and God. Food is often cooked in the same pan all day, sometimes for days, and washed rarely. Cross-contamination is a word no one knows. Illness comes and goes, and when people fall ill, they blame the stars, or bad air, or sin. Not the spoiled eels, or the undercooked fowl they ate from a cart on the corner. Still, some stalls are beloved passed down generations, or praised in gossip. You might hear a mason say, "The woman by the east gate serves the best tripe stew. Go before the priests get there." Or a fishmonger grumble, "Avoid the pastry boy. On Baker's Lane, he puts sawdust in the crust." Some townsfolk bring their own bowls tied to their belts and get them refilled daily like loyal customers. Others just follow the smoke and hope. Street food is noisy. You hear sizzling fat, the hiss of boiling ale, the clatter of wooden spoons, and shouting. Always shouting for orders, for payment for scraps, and smells, not all of them pleasant. The fish cart near the bridge has been here too long. The blood sausage man has grease running down his arms. A boy is selling sweet wafers dusted with honey and rosewater, a rare treat probably stolen from a monastery kitchen. At the edge of the square, a woman squats behind a small table. She doesn't even call out, just sits silently stirring something in a small clay pot over embers. You edge closer and see roasted chestnuts. Or are they broad beans coated in ash and salt? Either way, the smell draws you in. You buy a handful. They're hot, a little burnt, but satisfying. You eat them slowly, warming your fingers on the husks, and think this is a good day. But not everyone has a coin to spend. A few feet away, a boy kneels near a gutter, scraping something unidentifiable from a discarded pie tin. He licks it clean, wipes his face on his sleeve, and vanishes into the crowd. No one notices. This is how the poor eat in the city. Not by choice, not for pleasure, but because it's what's available, and it's faster than going home. In fact, many homes don't even have a kitchen, just a shared hearth, or a rented oven somewhere nearby. These stalls are the medieval fast food eaten standing up, bought from strangers, consumed quickly with fingers and risk and hope. And when the sun dips low and the vendors pack up, the town smells different. The smoke fades, the scraps are left for dogs and rats. You wipe your hands on your tunic already stained from days before and head back through the crooked alleys, belly slightly less hollow. You know you'll be back tomorrow. You always are. You catch the scent first. Not grease this time, but something sweet. It's subtle floral even. A whiff of honey, a hint of cinnamon, maybe rosewater, or cloves if you're lucky. But this is not the world of sugar-laden bakeries or mass-produced candy. In the medieval world, sweets were rare, expensive, and often slightly dangerous. You're still in the marketplace, but you've followed the scent to a different corner near a church wall, where nuns sometimes trade jams and herbal syrups for coins to support their orders. There, under a faded linen canopy, stands a merchant with a curious display: glazed fruits, brittle wafers, and something that glimmers faintly in the sunlight, sugar the white gold of its time. But don't let the sparkle fool you. In the Middle Ages, sugar was both a medicine and a mystery. Imported at great cost from the East through Venice and Arab trade routes, it was sold in small cones or molded into delicate shapes for the nobility. You don't see sugar much. If it's here at all, it's in the hands of an apothecary locked in a wooden chest. For common people, sweets meant honey, maybe boiled with wine or dried fruits. And even that could be rare. You edge closer to the stall. There's a jar of preserved quince, golden and sticky. Next to it, small balls of dried fig rolled in crushed nuts. You know that one wrong bite could mean trouble. This stuff isn't fresh. It was likely made days ago and has sat in the sun and wind all morning. You trade a coin for a triangle of something brittle and amber-colored. It crunches between your teeth, honey candy, perhaps mixed with flour and fennel seeds. It's oddly satisfying, but cloying, and sticks to your molars. You wonder if it's worth the risk of a toothache, which in these times could become a fatal infection. In the Middle Ages, sweet didn't always mean pleasant. Many so-called desserts were combinations that would seem strange today: pears, stewed in wine with onions, or sweet and sour sauces on meat pies. Spice was used lavishly when it could be afforded, and sweet things were laced with black pepper, ginger, or long pepper, a spicy sweet experience meant to excite the senses and prove the wealth of the cook. You glance at another merchant who sells a kind of spiced cake, not fluffy or soft like you might expect, but dense, hard, and dry. It's made from breadcrumbs, wine, and honey boiled down until it forms a thick paste, then pressed into molds. If the cake is a few days old, it might be slightly fermented. Still edible barely, but certainly not safe. You bite anyway. A woman beside you buys candied almonds, but as you look closer, you realize some are simply painted pebbles, fakes meant to trick children and foreigners. Food fraud is common, and there's little you can do if you're swindled. Complain too loudly, and you might find yourself accused of slander or worse. Some sweets are religious tied to feasts and fasts. During Lent or on saints' days, local nuns and monks sometimes give out small soul cakes, lightly sweetened rolls with dried fruit offered to children or the poor. These are precious. You remember once receiving one wrapped in a strip of cloth. It was so dry you had to soak it in broth, but it tasted like kindness. But sweets also walk the line between food and medicine. A sugar plum might really be a spiced ball made to treat indigestion. A syrup of honey and vinegar could be prescribed for coughs. If you're lucky enough to see a physician, or at least the town healer, you might be given a candied rose petal to chew. Healing, yes, but also a luxury. And yet, despite the risks, the spoilage, the fraud, the odd flavor combinations, the rotting teeth sweet still has its place in the medieval heart. It's a promise of joy in a hard world. A child licking honey from their fingers on a feast day. A bride gifted a sweetmeat wrapped in waxed paper. A sick elder offered spiced wine as comfort in their final days. You finish your shard of honey candy and smile just a little. It's not safe. It's not clean. But for a fleeting moment, you tasted something bright, something golden. That's enough. The sun begins to dip behind the thatched rooftops, and the smells of the street change with it. As evening approaches, hunger sharpens. People crave something hot, something rich, and most of all, something fried. But frying in the medieval world isn't the crisp perfection you might imagine today. It's riskier, heavier, and occasionally even toxic. And yet, despite it all, the people keep coming back for more. Frying takes fat, and fat is precious. It might be pig lard, goose fat, or even old butter clarified if someone had the knowledge, or just reheated and reused if they didn't. The oil often smells of yesterday's meal, and maybe even the one before that. But no one complains. Hot food is comforting, and fried food is filling two things a laborer or beggar can't take for granted. At a smoky corner near the tavern, a woman stirs a blackened iron pan over a fire that spits and hisses. She's making something like fritters. Blobs of dough, often made with peas or beans, fried until golden brown and then salted. They're gritty, sometimes scorched, but undeniably satisfying. You watch as a boy buys one, burns his mouth in eagerness, then begs for another. Salted food holds a different sort of danger. Everyone knows that salt is essential for preserving, especially in a world without refrigeration. But too much of it, or too much reliance on it, can bring its own problems. Meat might be salted until it's rock hard. Fish, too, especially herring, which is shipped in from the coasts and packed into barrels for inland towns. By the time it reaches here, it's often so pungent and dry that it must be soaked and boiled for hours just to become edible. But it keeps people alive in winter. And that's what matters. Then there's the fascination with fermentation. This is a world that ferments nearly everything, not just ale and wine, but cabbage, turnips, dairy, even certain grains. A pot of bubbling sauerkraut or sour porridge might be left out for days. Its sour tang is strong, its safety uncertain, but people eat it anyway. It fills the belly and helps preserve what little food exists. One particularly popular item is cheese, not the refined waxed wheels of later centuries, but strong-smelling, sharp-tasting curds, aged just long enough to be slightly soft and slightly dangerous. Mold is picked off casually, and the cheese is sliced thin to make it last longer. Children are fed small scraps. It's one of the few reliable sources of fat and protein, and often easier to digest than fresh milk, which can carry disease. And don't forget the fascination with animal odds and ends. Offal liver, lungs, kidneys are often fried or boiled and sold for cheap. Fried tripe might be a delicacy for the poor chewy and covered in herbs if the vendor's generous. Black pudding made from blood and barley is fried in slabs and handed out at markets. It's rich, oddly sweet, and deeply divisive. Some love it, others gag. The addictive quality of these foods lies not only in their flavor, but in the ritual. Standing in the cold, wrapped in wool and smoke, waiting for something hot and oily, it's a comfort, a promise, a reminder that even in a world of plague and famine, something warm still exists. Yet these indulgences come at a cost. Frying often occurs in pans not cleaned between batches. Animal fats go rancid quickly in summer. Salted fish might carry parasites. Cheese could be tainted. But those who eat them do so knowingly. It's a gamble like everything else in this precarious life. And still, the street cooks have their regulars. There's a blind man who always buys fried peas and eats them with his fingers. A midwife who stops by for curd fritters after long nights. A group of children who beg for scraps and sometimes get them hot, greasy, and irresistible. By the end of the evening, as the fires die down and the smell of charred lard fades, the square is littered with crumbs and bones. The vendors pack away what little is left, often saving it for themselves or feeding it to dogs. They'll be back tomorrow with the same pans and the same hope that what they offer, however risky, brings some measure of joy, of fullness, of survival. Because in the medieval world, food isn't just nourishment. It's a ritual, a risk, a reward. And no matter how questionable the ingredients, everyone keeps coming back for more. You wake up sore. Again. The haze still in your hair, and your hands are cracked from yesterday's cold. As your body stretches aching from another night on an uneven wooden frame, you catch a whiff, unmistakable, unavoidable, and it's coming from you. But in the Viking Age, dealing with that isn't simple. You want to wash. Everyone wants to wash. But that's not something you do casually, not when clean water is locked under sheets of ice or a long walk from the settlement. So you trudge down to the riverbank. It's winter. The air bites through the linen you're wrapped in. And as you break the frost over the stream with your stiff hands, you hesitate. Do you really want to submerge your face in that your skin's already raw from wind and smoke? But this is your best chance, so you grit your teeth. Scoop up a freezing handful and splash. It burns like fire. There's no soap? Not really. The Vikings sometimes used a kind of lye soap made from animal fat and ash, but that's not something you carry around. And it stings if you've got cuts or scrapes, which you almost certainly do. So for today, it's just icy water and a prayer that no one comes close enough to notice how bad you smell. Hair. Oh, yes, you still have to manage that. Vikings are often portrayed with sleek braids and immaculate beards, but the truth, lice were a constant companion. Combs carved from bone or antler were one of the most personal and important tools. You dig one out of your pouch and start scraping, tugging painfully at your tangled scalp. Every few passes you check for lice or nits. You find some. Of course you do. Everybody does. You pick them out, toss them away, and keep combing. The comb is public and private all at once. You don't share it. It's one of your few weapons in the war against filth. But grooming isn't vanity. It's survival. Filth brings disease. Disease brings weakness, and weakness gets you killed or replaced. Your fingernails are black with soot from the hearth and yesterday's work. You try to clean under them with a sliver of bone. It's not working. Your hands are stained and cracked, but at least now they look less like a blacksmith's and more like a farmer's. And then there's your clothes. They haven't been washed in days. Weeks, if you're honest. Laundering means boiling water, scrubbing wool with harsh soap, beating it on rocks, then waiting days for it to dry. In a damp climate, that's a luxury most can't afford regularly. So you live with the smell. You get used to it. Everybody smells. You just hope yours isn't worse than theirs. Women have their own burdens. Hair tucked beneath scarves or caps to avoid both lice and judgment. Washing their bodies privately, if they can, with the same icy water or heated leftovers from the cooking pots. Menstrual cloths, cleaned quietly, dried out of sight. Dignity is a delicate thing here, easily lost, hard to maintain. Dental care, ha 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 ha. You chew twigs, or rinse with salt water if you're lucky. Your teeth hurt. There's a black spot on your molar you've been ignoring. You touch it with your tongue and wince. There are no dentists, no sweet-smelling mint pastes, just patience and pain. And yet, despite all this, Vikings valued grooming. Appearance mattered. A clean beard could show social status. Braided hair meant you had time, and time meant power. Some carved ear scoops or tweezers to pick out wax or hairs, because even in a world of mud and blood, there's still pride. But today, your pride is soggy and frozen. You're half wet, your sleeves stiff with frost, where the water splashed and your hands have gone numb. You dry them on your tunic, which only makes you colder. The chores are calling and you haven't even eaten. And somehow, you're still not clean. You walk back to the longhouse shivering. Your face stings from the water, and your feet are still wet from the ice-crusted ground. You push open the thick wooden door, expecting warmth. But what greets you first isn't heat. It's smoke. Again. It always is. The hearth sits low in the center of the room, its coals smoldering under yesterday's ash, and a fresh log, just added by someone trying to boil porridge or dry wet boots. But there's no chimney, only a small opening in the roof, and it's doing a poor job today. The smoke curls upward, gets stuck in the rafters, then spreads sideways. Slowly, inevitably, it fills the house like mist on a still lake. You cough. You try to sit low, closer to the cleanest air. It's an old trick. Everyone knows it. The lower you are, the less you breathe in the haze. Children crawl around half-crouched for this reason, and the elders often sit near the door, wrapped in cloaks braving the draft, just to breathe easier. The smoke clings to your clothes, your hair, your bedding. You sleep in it, you eat in it, and you breathe it until your eyes sting and your throat aches. In winter, the fires never stop. In summer, they're needed for cooking and keeping flies away. There is no escaping it. And yet somehow, this is survival. Smoke preserves meat, dries fish, hardens wood, and chokes out pests. It was better than the mold and rot that came without it. The Viking Age longhouse was not just a home, It was a living system, and the smoke was its circulatory haze, irritating but essential. You glance around and see someone waving a cloak, trying to fan it toward the roof hole. Futile. There's no real draft, not unless someone opens the door and lets in another gust of winter. But that brings another problem, cold. So you stay trapped in this fog, lungs burning, eyes watering. At night it's worse. The doors are shut tight, the fire is banked for warmth, and the roof hole often iced over. You lie on your straw bedding, blinking through the haze. Some families have animals indoors, sheep or chickens, and their breath only adds to the fog. Between smoke-sweat animals and damp wool, the air turns thick enough to chew. Still, you have to be alert. Sparks sometimes jump, and a stray ember can set an entire wall ablaze. The longhouse is made of timber and thatch, and if fire takes hold, it doesn't ask permission. You've seen it happen in nearby villages, homes reduced to charred beams and wet ashes in minutes. The elders say the gods can see clearer through smoke, that the haze is part of the ritual offerings rise with it. You don't know if that's true. But you do know this every breath you take in here shortens something. You can feel it in your chest, in the tightness when you run outside, in the way old people wheeze before they sleep. Children often have coughs that never go away. The very young especially struggle to breathe at night. In wealthier homes, sometimes there's a small smoke loft or extra space above the hearth for heat to gather. But in yours, everyone shares the same space, the same air, the same sting in the throat. Even the walls sweat with it. Over time, the smoke blackens the beams and the cob walls, leaving soot streaks where it curls and pools. Your hands come away dirty after touching anything above shoulder height. You've stopped wearing pale colors, not that you had many to begin with. And yet, even this dense, choking gloom becomes background noise. It seeps into your senses until you barely notice. Until you step outside and your lungs pull in that first deep, fresh breath and it burns. Not from smoke, but from the raw cold of clean air you forgot still existed. The day presses on. The smoke doesn't leave. It wraps around you like another skin, invisible but clinging. A reminder that comfort in this world is never free. It always comes at the cost of something. Your sight, your breath, your silence. You grab the bowl of weak porridge someone left near the coals and sit beside the wall. Your eyes water as the smoke curls toward your face. You wipe them with your sleeve, already crusted with salt from yesterday's tears. And then you eat. Because there's nothing else to do. No other place to go. And you know that even when the fire dies down, the haze will stay floating there, silent and patient, waiting to be fed again. You finish your porridge slowly, not because you're savoring it, but because once it's gone, there won't be more until the evening, or maybe not even then. It's the same porridge you've had for days, oats boiled with water, thickened with yesterday's leftovers, if you're lucky, or sprinkled with a pinch of salt if someone remembered. You don't eat for pleasure. You eat to stop the ache. The fire crackles beside you as you scrape the wooden bowl clean, trying not to think about how long it will be until your next meal. Hunger here isn't a passing feeling. It's a companion. It lingers through the day, like the smoke settling in your gut, numbing your mind, always present in the background of everything you do. There are no feasts in this part of the world unless someone is getting married, giving birth, or dying, and even then, they're modest. The image of Vikings gnawing meat from bones, surrounded by roaring fires and flowing mead. That's the dream of poets and skalds, not the reality you live. Most days, your meals are whatever you can stretch from the stores. Flat barley bread, coarse and hard, from being left out too long. Dried peas boiled into mush. A piece of dried fish, if the sea has been kind. Root vegetables pulled from the earth. Turnips. Onions, maybe a parsnip, if the ground wasn't too frozen to dig. It's repetitive. It's bland. But it keeps you upright. Meat is rare. Animals are more valuable alive for milk wool labor and manure. A slaughtered animal is a statement, either celebration or desperation. You remember the last time a goat was killed. It was thin, sickly, and already near death. The meat was stringy and smelled off, but nobody said a word as they cooked it. Hunger silences pride. You sometimes dream of butter, not because it's your favorite, but because it's soft, rich, and almost luxurious compared to the cracked bread and water-thin stew you're used to. A smear of butter on a hot flat cake pulled from the pan at just the right time, that in your world is indulgence. There are moments when someone tries to add flavor. Wild herbs, thyme, marjoram, mustard leaves are foraged and thrown into the pot. In spring, a young girl brought back a handful of sorrel, and its lemony bite transformed a whole meal. Everyone noticed. Everyone remembered. But spices, those belong to kings, to merchants sailing from lands so far away, their names sound like spells. You've heard of pepper cloves, cinnamon, but only from travelers or from priests whispering about the East. You will never taste them. You may never even see them. You look at the others in the longhouse. A child sucks on a boiled turnip, scraping it with his teeth like it's the leg of a chicken. An old woman dips stale bread into broth and lets it soften before gumming it down. No one complains. Complaining uses energy, and energy is precious. And yet, even here, food is ceremony. The first harvest is celebrated. A well-caught fish is passed around like treasure. At solstice, people prepare special bread, sometimes pressed with carved patterns, and they burn a piece as an offering. There is dignity still in the ritual of eating, even when the food itself barely satisfies. You remember one winter long ago when the snow never stopped and the stores ran low. A family in the next village boiled bark. The children cried from the pain of it, stomachs swollen, the fibers too rough. They survived, but barely, and no one judged them. Everyone knew that if it lasted another week, they would have done the same. Even now, you count each meal in your mind. You remember how much grain is left, how many onions are still buried in straw, how many dried fish still hang in the rafters. You think in numbers 3 more days of oats, 5 more roots, 1 more slab of salt pork hidden at the back, saved for the day the baby is born or the elder dies. Food here isn't about fullness. It's about holding on. A way to measure time until spring. A quiet rebellion against hunger's constant knocking. And so you stand up, brush crumbs from your lap, and carry your bowl to the water bucket. You scoop rinse and hang it by the wall, ready for the next round, ready for another meal of survival, not satisfaction. You don't expect pleasure from your next bite. You expect just enough to keep walking, just enough to keep thinking, just enough to make it through one more smoky, bitter, hungry day. You barely notice it now. The musky mix of smoke, sweat, and livestock has settled into your skin like a second cloak. Your tunic, stained from work and weeks of wear, clings to your body with the heaviness of unwashed wool. There is no perfume, no soap, beyond what's boiled from leftover animal fat and ashes. And even that is reserved for rare occasions or the hands of the midwife. No one around you smells any better. The entire village shares the same stench, so the air itself feels thick with it. Bathing is not routine. It's a ritual, and a risky one at that. Water, when cold, can steal the life from your lungs. Firewood is scarce, and heating a whole tub is a luxury for the wealthy or for saints' feast days. Maybe once a week, if the weather allows, and someone's in a generous mood, you'll get a basin to splash your face, armpits, and feet. A full soak. That's a memory from childhood or a future hope. You've seen the stream run brown after a washing. Bits of hay, flecks of skin, the smears of a long day's labor floating away. But the water doesn't carry the smell with it, not really. The sweat of weeks past returns before you even finish drying your hair, especially when your chores begin again the moment you're dressed. You know this is how it is for everyone. The farmer smells of cows and soil. The leather worker reeks of tannin and rot. The fisher folk carry the sharp perfume of scales and brine. Even the priest, cloaked in robes, wears the scent of candle smoke and mildew. You can't escape it. You don't try. You just learn to stop noticing. And yet, you've met outsiders, traders from across the sea, or nobles visiting on pilgrimage who recoil when they step into your world. Their faces twist, their sleeves cover their noses. You don't need to be told, you smell. Their eyes say it plainly, but what do they expect? You don't have access to rosemary water, fine linens, or scented oils. You have ashes, and maybe if you're lucky, a handful of crushed mint leaves once the herbs come in spring. You remember one of the monks talking about the Romans, how they bathed daily, soaked in hot water, scraped oils from their skin. You laughed, not because it's funny, but because it sounds like a fantasy. Who has that kind of time, that kind of fuel, that kind of water? Still you try in small ways. On feast days, you'll rinse your hands and face, maybe rub your hair with a cloth. Some women braid in dried lavender or wear sachets of herbs around their necks. Men might scrape their beards or brush their teeth with salt and ash. It's not much, but it's something, a gesture toward dignity in a world where filth always finds you. You've seen people judged for smelling worse than the norm, usually the sick, or the poor beyond poor, the ones who sleep in damp corners, who haven't eaten enough to sweat, who can't carry their own waste far enough away from the home. Their scent is different, sour, sharp, unsettling. It marks them, warns others, not just of poverty, but of danger. Sometimes death follows that smell. There are places where the stench is unbearable. The outhouse, the tanner's shed, the piles of manure left too long in the sun. But even there you endure. You cover your face with a sleeve, breathe through your mouth, and keep moving. What else can you do? Sometimes, when the wind is right, the scent of pine needles or fresh rain will cut through the grime. And for a moment, you remember what clean used to feel like. Not just on the skin, but in the lungs and the soul. It passes quickly. The next animal must be fed. The next chore must be done. You live in a world where the cleanest scent is the smell of smoke on your tunic, because it means warmth, because it means the food was cooked, because it means you survived another day. So no, you don't smell good, but neither does anyone else. And that in its own strange way is comforting. You are not alone in the stink. You are not separate from the struggle. You are part of it, a walking, breathing reminder that this life is lived close to the earth, raw and real. And perhaps long after you're gone, someone will find your bones and wonder how you lived. They'll never know the smell. But you did. Every single day. You don't eat sweets? Not really. The idea of dessert, something just for pleasure, something at the end of a meal to make you smile, is as foreign to your world as flying carpets or singing angels. Sugar exists, but it's locked away behind monastery walls or packed into tiny pouches on spice caravans that might pass through once in your lifetime. When it shows up, it's not eaten, it's prescribed. To you, sugar is a treatment, not a treat. It might be stirred into bitter herbal brews to help someone swallow them. It might be mixed into a poultice for a festering wound, or given to a noblewoman who's fainted from heat in the blood. You've heard that royal doctors sometimes crush pearls with sugar to make a tonic for the dying. But you're not royalty. You're just a soul trying to make it to winter. What you do have sometimes is honey. But even that is a gift from the gods, or at least from bees brave enough to build hives near your fields. Beekeeping is a sacred skill guarded and passed down. Honey is sticky gold, and when it graces your table, it's a moment worth remembering. Maybe a smear on a crust of coarse rye bread during Easter. Maybe a spoonful in a gruel when someone's been sick and needs cheering. But more often, it's saved for holy days, for saints' feasts, weddings, births, or death rites. You taste it, and it sings. But then it's gone, and you're back to cabbage and onions. So, when you crave something sweet, you turn to what you have. Berries in the late summer, if the birds haven't stolen them first. Roasted chestnuts, not sugary, but soft and warm, and almost sweet after hours in the coals. You might dry plums or apples in the sun, threading them on strings to hang from your rafters. When hunger stretches thin, even these feel like candy. You remember once a merchant's child dropped a stick of candied almond on the road. You found it half melted and dust covered. You licked it anyway. And for that moment, the world shifted. You tasted almonds and roses, and something you'd later learn was saffron. You never tasted it again. But you never forgot. There's a rumor, always a rumor, of nobles who eat glazed pears of convents where marzipan is shaped into little lambs for the nativity. Some say there are entire banquets with candied violets, sugar sculptures, and pies that spill dates and cinnamon when sliced. But these might as well be fairy tales. You've never seen them. You've never even met anyone who has. And yet on feast days, something magical does happen. The village women gather what they can: barley flour, goose fat, dried fruit, and fry little cakes over the hearth. Their hard dents often burnt on the outside. But if someone had saved a pinch of honey or dried mint, they might mix it in. These are your sweets. You eat them hot and fast with the excitement of a child and the reverence of a monk, because this is what joy tastes like in your world. You've heard stories of the ancient world of Roman honey cakes and Egyptian date syrups, of Persian sweets wrapped in gold leaf. It feels distant, like another planet. But maybe one of your ancestors once tasted those things. Maybe sweetness is buried in your bones. But for now, you return to your salted fish, your root stew, your oat porridge. And when your tongue remembers that one sweet bite from years ago, that burst of sun-warmed strawberry, or a sliver of honey on festival bread, you hold on to it. Because in this life, joy is not cheap. It's fleeting, sacred, and always earned. In your world, thirst is dangerous. The stream looks clear. The well seems deep. But drink the wrong drop, and you might not wake up tomorrow. Dysentery fevers, cramps that twist your gut like the devil's own fingers. Everyone knows someone who drank the wrong water. Even children learn early trust the alewife more than the river. So you drink ale, every day. Everyone does, even the children. But this isn't the kind of ale that makes men shout or fight or fall into fire. It's small ale brewed light and low with just enough fermentation to kill the worst of the water's demons. It's cloudy, flat, and earthy, served from cracked jugs and old leather bottles. It won't make you merry, but it might keep you alive. You might remember your grandmother saying, "Better drunk than dead." Not because she meant it literally, but because in a village without physicians, sometimes the line between poison and potion is a muddy stream. Real drunkenness, though the kind nobles indulge in, is something you only witness at weddings or on saints' days. That's when the stronger stuff comes out. Maybe a bitter mead from someone who keeps bees. Maybe a fiery cider from the monks across the valley. Maybe even a splash of wine, if a generous priest, a passing merchant, or a harvest miracle brings a bottle into your village. Wine is a holy thing. In church, you see the priest lift the chalice and you know it's not for everyone. The taste of it, sharp red sacred, is a memory tied to ceremonies and caskets. You've sipped it only during communion, maybe once a year, and even then it's watered down. There's a story passed around about a man who drank nothing but clean spring water and lived to be 100. But that man lived in a poem, not in your fields. Here, even clear water can kill, and beer is a kind of medicine. At harvest time, when work is endless and sleep is brief, the ale flows more freely. You drink to quench your thirst, to soften your aches, and to shut out the moans of your joints. You don't drink to forget you drink, because it's the only thing safer than trusting your own well. In some rare seasons, the cider is good. The apples are plenty. The juice ferments just right. Those are the years you might feel a little lightheaded after supper, or laugh too loudly at your neighbor's joke. For a moment you feel rich, not rich in coin, but in comfort. Monks and brewers understand the balance brew too strong, and the field workers sleep instead of sow. Brew too weak, and the sickness returns. So they measure prey and boil the mash, watching it foam like a cauldron of hope. What happens when you drink too much? You stumble, you sing. You might fall into the mud. But more often, you just sleep deeper and dream a little softer than usual. You don't crave drunkenness. You crave safety. And in your world where hunger stalks and water deceives, the mug in your hand is more than a drink. It's survival. And if one night you drink a little too fast, your thoughts might wander. What does a Venetian merchant drink as he counts his gold? What wine flows in the castles where minstrels play and kings feast? Will you ever know the taste of something aged in a barrel, spiced like the tales in winter? You don't know. But tonight your ale is warm. It doesn't bite. And tomorrow, if you're lucky, you'll wake without fever and drink again. Bread is not a treat in your world. It is a duty. A daily grind, quite literally. You wake to its sleep, after it chew it without joy. It is there to stop your stomach from shouting nothing more. But even then, some days, not enough of it exists. Your bread is not white, not soft, not fragrant with yeast like the loaves they bake in noble ovens. No, your bread is black, heavy, coarse, made from rye oats, barley, whatever your land can grow and your hands can thresh. Wheat, that's a dream for the rich, the monasteries, and the millers who take their cut before you even see the flour. You grind the grain with a quernstone, backbent arms aching. If your village is lucky, there's a mill nearby powered by water or wind, but it costs coin or a toll in grain, and not everyone can spare it. So most grind by hand in dusty corners, where flour dust coats the walls like pale soot. The dough is sticky dark and bitter. You knead it with cracked fingers and let it rise if you're lucky enough to have a starter saved from yesterday. If not, you bake it flat, like a sad, heavy cake. There is no butter, no honey, no fine ash to lighten the crust. Just flour, water, salt, and prayers. The oven is shared. Or it's yours. A pit lined with stones heated with dry branches, dung, or leftover coals. You bake your loaves alongside your neighbors. The best bread is dense and keeps for days, though it grows tougher each sunrise. The worst turns green by morning mold, spreading like moss across a wet stone. You eat the bread dry, or you dip it. Into broth if there's meat. Into ale if there's nothing else. You feed it to your children first. You count slices with your eyes. You hide the last chunk beneath cloth so no one begs you for it. Hunger is always nearby, like a wolf pacing just beyond the firelight. Some seasons bring more grain. Others bring none. When the rains fail, or the frost comes too early, or the lords demand more than you can give your bread thins, you stretch it with ground, beans, acorns, chestnuts, and sometimes you eat it, knowing it will make your belly cramp. But it's that or nothing. There's an old saying, bread for the body, truth for the soul. But in times like these, even the body gets lied to. You remember the famine 2 winters past. The bread then was almost black, with bark ground, fine and bitter. People whispered of families eating clay, of parents giving the last heel of bread to a baby that wouldn't wake in the morning. Those memories don't fade. They cling, even when the barn is full. Bread is political too. Lords hoard grain. Monasteries seal it in barrels. Town markets sell it dearer than gold when war comes close. You've watched fights break out over a half loaf. You've seen a man beaten for stealing a roll. You've seen the baker weep because the flour ran out and 5 more families came knocking. And yet, it is bread that binds you. The blessing at the table, the peace offering, the harvest feast's first course. You break it together at weddings and funerals. Even when thin and cracked, it reminds you that you are alive, that you share this hunger with everyone around you. One day, a stranger from the road offered you a crust white fluffy dotted with seeds. He said it came from a city far away, where bakers knead with strong arms and ovens roar like dragons. You tasted it and almost cried, not because it was good, but because it made you realize what you'd never had. Still, you return to your bread, your black bread, your bitter loyal companion, the one that never tastes sweet but is always there, until it isn't. There's a look people get when the food runs out. It's in the eyes. Wild red rim, no longer curious, just desperate. You've seen it before. You've worn it yourself. Hunger doesn't simply weaken the body, it warps the spirit. Makes enemies of friends. Makes monsters of neighbors. When the grain sacks are empty, and the root cellar holds only frost, kindness becomes a memory. You recall the winter, when old Maud, the herb woman, bartered willow bark for a scrap of meat, and the next morning, her hut was ransacked. No thief admitted to it, but no one denied it either. People whispered that someone found a spoon with dried blood on it buried in her hearth ash. But hunger doesn't only breed cruelty, it also breeds ingenuity. You've watched mothers soak weeds and call it soup. You've seen young boys trap squirrels with twine and stones. Children learn which leaves numb the tongue and which flowers stew into something faintly sweet. Even moss has been boiled in your village, scraped from stones and flavored with stale ale. During the lean months, you've heard strange advice passed from one household to another. Boil nettles but skim the foam, Roast the mice over green branches, not dry ones, they taste less like ash. Eat the bark only once you've dried it 3 days. Nothing is off limits when bellies cave inward. You've eaten things you never speak of. Once a traveler came through offering a pie with a rich, greasy smell. He said it was goose, but no goose flies in frost. You chewed, you swallowed, and you never asked. You remember the baker's son once round, and pink turning gaunt and sharp-boned by spring. One day, he stopped sharing his crusts with the dogs. The next, the dogs were gone. And then one day, so was he. There are stories. Some you try not to believe. A mother who smothered one of her twins to feed the other. A man who dug up a buried cow long before the rot left it. A priest who fasted with holy pride until someone caught him gnawing marrow from a bone behind the altar. But hunger also teaches you cunning. How to stretch a meal into 3. How to flavor a broth with nothing but a heated stone, a sprig of mint, and imagination. How to fake fullness by chewing slowly and drinking hot water. You've learned to tighten belts, to silence the grumble with prayer, to hum while cooking, so children think something better is coming. You've seen food used as a weapon, lords doubling taxes in famine years, forcing villagers to choose between bread and loyalty, monasteries locking their grain stores while preachers spoke of charity. Sometimes the cruelest thing isn't withholding food, it's letting people smell it and telling them, come back tomorrow. Still, hunger does more than punish. It binds. You've shared your last crust with a crying stranger and wept when they did the same. You've split a cold turnip 6 ways and made it feel like a feast. The cruel times reveal the clever, yes, but also the generous. The kind who still give even when they're starving. There's a phrase they say during bad harvests: empty hands make sharp knives. You understand now. It means more than theft. It means survival, desperation, transformation. It means that when all else is gone, hunger writes its own laws. And you live by them. Every meal is a victory. Every bite is a kind of defiance. You survive not because you feast, but because you refuse to let hunger hollow out your humanity completely. Not yet. In a world where clean water is a gamble, even bad ale is a blessing. You've drunk brews so thin they looked like dishwater, so tart they curled your tongue, but you drank them anyway. Because you had to. Because the alternative might send you to the grave faster than the hunger ever could. The well in your village isn't pure. You know this. You've watched it cough up cloudy water in the spring, teeming with little things you can't see, but always feel later cramps, fever, retching. People who drank only water died younger. The wise ones learned to brew, but brewing requires grain. And when grain is scarce, the ale gets weaker. The barley's barely there. A cup of it might taste more like hay or sour herbs than beer. Still, even that brew, thinned with water, soured in a clay jug, is safer than the stream. And so it becomes a daily ritual, a cup at dawn, another at dusk. A toast, not to pleasure, but to survival. Children are raised on it. The old survive by it. Not because it's strong, but because it's boiled, fermented, cleansed by fire and time. Even monks sworn to simple lives make it in their abbeys not just to sell, but to drink. Not to forget their troubles, but to keep the fever at bay. You remember one winter when the brew was so weak it barely frothed. People joked that the barrel must have cried instead of fermented. Still, no one poured it out. Even the bitterest batch was too precious to waste. It gave you something warm. It gave you something to hold. In the cities, taverns served it with pride, if they had enough grain. But for the poor, what passed as ale was often made with whatever could be found: chestnuts, beans, even tree bark once ground fine. Some brewed nettle beer. Others fermented crab apples until they fizzed like a curse. One neighbor even swore by a brew of turnip and honey. You never dared ask for seconds. The quality varied by season. A harvest year might mean malty richness and a foam thick enough to rest a spoon on. A famine year meant brown liquid in chipped cups that smelled faintly of vinegar. But it was still safer than the well. You've seen ale used for healing, mixed with crushed herbs and bitter roots. You've seen it used to wash wounds when water ran black. You've seen midwives give it to birthing mothers to dull the pain. And you've seen drunks fall asleep by the hearth after one cup too many, though it barely counted as a real drink. Ale wasn't luxury, it was lifeline. It bound communities. Brew days were events. Women would gather with their pots and strains and stir the mash while gossiping. Children would sneak sips when backs were turned. Men would argue over strength and spice. Even the weakest brew carried warmth, comfort, ritual. There was power in the brewing. Not everyone could do it right. Let the mash sit too long and it spoiled. Skip the herbs and it turned flat. But when done well, even the weakest ale carried the faintest sweetness of barley, a ghost of the feast it might have been in better times. So you drank, morning, noon, and night, not to dull your mind, but to keep it clear, to stay upright, to keep the ache in your belly from turning into sickness, to survive another day. In the end, you don't remember the taste so much as the feeling of holding a warm cup between cold hands, of sipping slowly, pretending it was strong, of thanking the gods not for luxury, but for anything that wouldn't kill you. Because in times like these, even the weakest ale was stronger than the world trying to break you. You've never tasted saffron, but you've heard its name whispered like a charm. It's meant to be golden, rich, precious, something only the nobles would know. You've seen what they eat on the rare occasions the Lord's retinue pass through the village carts, clattering with cured hams, honeyed figs, baskets of almonds, wheels of cheese the size of cradles. You watched always from a distance. You were not invited to the table, not even close. While you scraped the bottom of a pot for parsnip broth, they feasted behind stone walls on dishes so layered with spice and salt, even the meat forgot its original taste. Roast swan stuffed with pork and herbs, lamb soaked in imported vinegar, custards laced with sugar, real sugar, not boiled down beet syrup. Their bread was soft white, risen high with precious yeast. Yours was dark flat, sometimes hard enough to crack a tooth. You remember one winter's night trudging through mud past the manor gates. Through the slats, you caught the smell of meat roasting over apple wood. It hit your nostrils so hard it made you dizzy. You hadn't had meat in 3 weeks. Your dinner that night, onion boiled in weak ale. No bread, no salt. How could two stomachs live in such different worlds? Inside those high halls, they didn't just eat, they performed. Courses rolled out like theater. Pies that bled sweet syrup when cut. Fish shaped like birds. Loaves carved to look like lions. The food wasn't just nourishment, it was a symbol of dominance, of separation, of power. The more exotic the dish, the louder it shouted, "I am not one of you." You, a peasant, a villain, a tenant, were never meant to touch those spices. Cinnamon, clove, ginger, nutmeg. They came from so far away, across oceans and deserts, brought by merchants who'd never set foot in a field. These flavors cost more than your year's rent. One dish at the Lord's table might contain ingredients from 5 different kingdoms. While you prayed, your cabbage patch would survive the frost. Yet hunger made you curious. You'd ask the old ones what those feasts were like, those who once worked in the kitchens or polished silver for the head table. They'd whisper of dishes with names so strange they sounded like spells. They spoke of venison, dripping with wine, sauce of pastries, with almond milk, and rosewater of plates too fine to scrape clean. One woman long retired once wept as she recalled the leftovers she was forbidden to take home meat thrown to the hounds while her brother starved. How many nights did you eat with your eyes, watching their carts roll by, smelling what you couldn't touch, listening to laughter echo across stone, while your family shared silence over an empty bowl? But even they, those nobles, feared famine in their own way. Their greed for variety made them hoard. Their cooks were under pressure to deliver novelty. A lord might exile a chef for overcooking the goose. For you, that same bird would have been a godsend, feathers and all. You may not have sat at their table, but their excess was felt in your hunger. Every extra pound of wheat baked into their sweetened loaves was grain taken from the village store. Every suckling pig on their spit was one less in the common fields. Even during lean years, their feasts continued. While mothers fed their children nettle porridge banquets in the castle, overflowed if not with food, then with illusion. They could afford illusion. You could not, and yet you survived. Somehow, despite the gnawing emptiness, despite the mockery of golden tables out of reach, you made it to another season. Not by indulgence, but by endurance. Not by spice, but by soil. The divide was real. You felt it in your bones, your belly, your breath. Their feast was your famine. Their fullness, your ache. And still you endured. You don't just eat to live. You crave. Even now, even with an empty belly and a broken harvest, you still crave. Craving is the echo of memory, the roasted chestnut you once had at 7 winters old, given to you by a wandering tinker. You've chased that sweetness ever since. Or the pear you stole from the Lord's orchard during a drought-green tart so cold against your tongue it made your teeth ache. You got caught, but it was worth it, because in that moment you tasted more than fruit. You tasted rebellion. You tasted life. When you've grown up poor with hunger, always nearby, craving becomes a companion. It whispers to you in the quiet. It paints pictures behind your eyes, not just of food, but of fullness, of safety, of warmth. Your body remembers what your table forgets. And it's not just you. Everywhere you look, others carry their cravings like hidden wounds. The woman next door, who sniffs wild mint like it's perfume. The boy who hoards acorns in his pockets, though they're bitter and barely edible. The old man who speaks of butter the way others speak of miracles. Craving teaches you to imagine. That's a dangerous power. Because when food is rare, dreaming of food is sacred. You begin to see it everywhere in clouds, in bark, in the glint of river stones. Your senses sharpen. You know the weight of a carrot just by holding the stem. You can tell if barley is spoiled by the sound it makes in a sack. You can smell mold from 2 rooms away. Your hands know how to scrape, how to soak, how to stretch every flavor until it becomes something close to enough. But enough is a ghost. In the manor, enough is a platter not yet emptied. In your home, enough is a pot that's not yet burned. There is no shared language between the craving of the poor and the indulgence of the rich. When you crave it, is with your whole being. It's not about taste, it's about survival. The ache is in your teeth, your knees, your sleep. You dream of bread more often than love. You wake up chewing nothing. Even when food arrives, you eat it too fast, too hungrily, because part of you doesn't believe it's real, or that it will last. That's what lifelong hunger does. It makes joy suspicious. It turns even soup into strategy. Some say craving is gluttony, that you should be grateful for what little you have. But how can you explain to someone who's always been full what it means to want not out of greed, but out of memory? Craving isn't shameful. It's ancestral. It's what drove your great-grandmother to boil leather shoes into soup. What made your uncle eat dandelions with mustard seeds to trick his stomach? What made you watch birds fly and wonder if you too could eat feathers? It's what keeps you alive. And in rare moments, when someone passes you a ripe plum or a bowl of stew you didn't expect, craving becomes a kind of joy, a silent celebration, a quiet miracle. You don't talk about it, but you feel it. That brief sense of being whole, of not needing, of tasting something all the way through. No fear, no rationing, just flavor, real and present. Those moments remind you that craving isn't a curse, it's a sign. That your spirit hasn't given up, that your body still believes in more. That despite everything, famine, frost, fear, you still want. You still imagine. You still hope. Because even if your bowl is empty, your soul still burns with the idea of enough. And that in the end is more powerful than any feast. The Viking Age wasn't a fantasy. It was a ferocious test of spirit, bone, and blood. Life offered no guarantees, only hard-won moments between storms, raids, and hunger. You wouldn't just need muscle to survive. You'd need instincts sharpened, like blades, a stomach that could stomach anything, and a will that didn't crack when the fjord winds screamed. To be Viking was to live every day, knowing it might be your last, and walking into that truth anyway. Most today wouldn't last a morning, not because we're weaker, but because we've forgotten what it means to be constantly aware, constantly vulnerable, and still unyielding. They didn't have comfort, but they had courage. No safety, but endless skill. You might admire them from afar, but if you woke up in their world barefoot in the snow, with nothing but your breath and blade, you'd realize this wasn't a movie. It was survival, and it was brutal.